All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's event is hosted by the Environmental Cooperative at Vassar Barnes and the Vassar Ecological Preserve with a very special guest from the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. My name is Lauren Bell, and I'm the Education and Outreach Assistant at the Environmental Cooperative. And I'm going to be going over a quick introduction of the Environmental Cooperative and the Ecological Preserve, and then a little introduction on how to identify the red maple tree, which Katie and Vicki will go into in a little bit more depth. And we have Katie Beals with us tonight, and she is the Land Stewardship, Outreach, and Research Assistant at the Ecological Preserve and is also a Student Conservation Association member. She will be leading us through an introduction to the Phenology Trail at Vassar and talk about the different species that we monitor there and how we monitor them. And then we have Vicki Kelly, who is the Environmental Monitoring Program Manager at the Cary Institute. And she's really going to talk to us about the red maple story. She'll discuss the phenology of the red maple and its significance as a climate change indicator. So at the end of the night, we're going to have a question period. We will have the Q&A going. We're going to have the chat closed throughout the night. So just throw any questions into the Q&A. We should have about 15 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. And we also have Jen Rubo here tonight with us. She is the director of the Environmental Cooperative, and she'll be available to answer questions during the Q&A. All right, so let's get started. So before moving forward, I'd like to acknowledge that the Vassar campus exists on lands that were once home to the Delaware Nation, the Delaware Lenape tribe, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans. Although many sources reference the Wappingers as the indigenous peoples of our campus, they were a confederacy of Native peoples who organized at one time in response to Euro-American incursions into the area and no longer exist as an organized group. So here, who are we at the Environmental Cooperative? We are located in the renovated barn space at the Vassar Farm and Ecological Preserve, located on Vassar College's campus. And our mission is to actively create and maintain natural areas to connect people with the outdoors and their community, as well as to foster a greater community mindset of environmental stewardship. And we work really hard to connect the Vassar community to the Poughkeepsie community and Hudson Valley community and vice versa. And so the Environmental Cooperative is located on the Vassar Ecological Preserve, but the preserve has its own mission that focuses on promoting increased understanding and appreciation of the natural systems on the preserve through field-based research. And where is the Ecological Preserve? The Ecological Preserve is located just across from Vassar's main campus, which is across Hooker Avenue, right in the town of Poughkeepsie. And there's a lot going on at the Ecological Preserve. It's not just the Environmental Cooperative and research at Vassar College. There's also community gardens, meaning that people can purchase a plot and maintain and grow plants. The PFP is also on the Ecological Preserve. They have education opportunities. They run a CSA. They grow vegetables and fruits. There's an urban medicinal garden, and they provide food for local restaurants as well as the Vassar dining halls. There's rugby fields, there's trails for cross country, trails for people to use for hiking, biking, walking, storage in the old barns, of course, the Environmental Cooperative, and then the Collins Field Station. So the Vassar Ecological Preserve is comprised of 415 acres with a variety of habitats that include forests, streams, wetlands, and old fields, also known as meadows. There's 7 miles of trails that can be used for hiking, running, and biking. It's also used as an academic resource for a variety of courses. And in a normal year without COVID, we get about 20,000 visitors per year. So we're really thrilled about how this has become a really valuable space for Vassar and the Poughkeepsie community. There are 290 acres of forest that sequester carbon. So this means that The trees at the Ecological Preserve are like superheroes. They take the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, and the trees use it to grow. The trees and soil also store this carbon for long periods of time. The forests also provide a wildlife corridor. And then the Casper-Kill floodplain that goes through the Ecological Preserve helps to reduce flooding and provides habitat, prevents erosion, and improves water quality. We also have old fields, which are a really important habitat, also known as meadows, and there's over 250 wildflower species, which feed our pollinators. The Ecological Preserve also serves as a refuge for rare plant and rare plant species and ecological communities that are threatened by habitat loss and climate change. And green spaces are also really important for public health and mental health. So we love that the Ecological Preserve provides this space for the Vassar community and the Poughkeepsie community. All right, so now we're getting into the really good stuff. And now's the time to really pay attention because we're going to have a little poll after this section that'll give you a little quiz about what is phenology and also how to identify the red maple tree. So next time you're walking down the street or walking on a trail, you'll be able to say, hey, that's a red maple tree. I learned that the other day. So first, what is phenology? Phenology is the study of seasonal changes. So this could be when the trees leaf out, or when flowers open, which we're seeing a lot right now, when birds migrate, when leaves fall off the trees in the fall. And so overall, I really like this definition from the New York Phenology Project, that phenology is the study of life cycle events for plants and animals, and it is the art of learning how to notice. It is invaluable to our understanding of biological impacts of climate change. So we had some people ask us before our presentation tonight, are you doing a presentation on phenology or phrenology? And so we just want to go over these two definitions quickly before moving on. So we're studying phenology tonight, which I just mentioned is the study of seasonal changes, whereas phrenology is the detailed study of the shape and size of the cranium as a supposed indication of character and mental abilities. So tonight, again, it's phenology, not phrenology. And so why is phenology important? Well, studying phenology really helps us to detect changes, detect patterns of changes in the world that helps us understand how species and ecosystems are reacting to climate change and human impact. An example of change in this area is that it's getting a bit warmer and wetter, which could cause some invasive species to thrive, which would displace some of our important native species. Studying phenology has also allowed scientists to discover that the green up is advancing by 2 days per decade, and that over the last 50 years, the growing season has lengthened approximately 12 days. The red maple tree is a really wonderful example of how climate change, of how a climate change indicator, because its time of flowering and greening is really starting to change. All right, so Vicki Kelly will get more into the phenology of the red maple and its importance as a climate change indicator later on, but I just want to go over a few tips that will help you to identify the red maple tree. So leaf arrangement is one way to help you identify a tree. Leaves can be arranged either alternately, meaning that they're going to be staggered on the twig, or they can be directly opposite one another. Leaves can also be whorled, meaning that 3 or more leaves are equally spaced at the node. Maple trees are a good example of leaves that are opposite, and we can see right here in this picture that the red maple is in fact opposite because these are directly across from each other. A leaf venation is another helpful hint in identification, and red maples are palmate, so that means they resemble the palm of your hand. So next time you're out, you can kind of look at leaves and see what do these veins remind me of. And red maples and maples in general are usually good examples of palmate leaves. And then identifying if a leaf is simple or compound is another great identifying feature. Red maple is going to be a simple leaf. And if it's simple, it just means that there is only one single blade with a bud at the base of the leaf stem. And so the leaf shape and the leaf edges are also going to be important. This is especially important for the red maple as it distinguishes it from other similar species. If leaves are smooth, they're entire. If leaves, they can also be dentate, serrate, crenate, lobed, or parted. So we often talk about the red maple as being lobed and toothed. So for example, we're going to look at the red maple versus the Norway maple. So the red maple here, you can see that the lobes are rather V-shaped, whereas for the Norway maple, they're more U-shaped. And then also the edges on this red maple are going to look more toothed, whereas on the Norway maple, they're going to be smoother. And on sugar maples, they're smoother as well. So that's a good way to differentiate the red maple from other common maples in this area. All right, and so there's also red maple flowers. I'm just going to go over this quickly because Vicki Kelly's going to go into this more, but they are blooming right now, and some of them are starting to show leaves, or the females are actually producing seeds. I found some today that I brought with me. So in this picture, in the center, the males are on the left and the females are on the right, and they usually flower between March and May. And now that it's late April, we're going to start to see leaves and start to see the female trees produce fruits, which are called samaras, which also right here and on the picture in the right. And then if you want to identify the red maple in the winter, the bark of the tree is a really good way to go. When the bark is young, it's going to be smooth and a lighter gray. As it gets more mature, it can sometimes show these really interesting spider web patterns on it. And it's going to gradually get a bit darker. And then a mature red maple is going to be a darker gray. It's going to be a rougher texture and sometimes appears in peeling flakes. All right, so now we're going to do a few quick poll questions and see how you feel for identifying a red maple tree. All right, so first, what is phenology? Is it the study of ecosystems in spring, the study of red maple trees, or the study of seasonal changes? Right, it looks like everyone was paying attention. Awesome job. Yes, phenology is the study of seasonal changes. All right, and our next one is, are red maple leaves alternate or opposite? Get a little bit trickier. All right, so almost everyone got this one too. Red maple leaves are in fact opposite, and most maple trees in general are opposite. Right, on to maple flowers. When do red maple trees usually flower in this area? So it could be June to July, April to July, March to May, or April to June. Yeah, so this one was a little trickier, but still most of you got it. It's March to May. Awesome job. All right, and this last question about red maples is, how would you describe the bark on a mature red maple tree? Be brown and reddish with a rough texture, smooth and light gray, or dark gray and rough in texture. All right, awesome. It looks like almost everyone got this one too. Great job. So there's just one more question I want to ask before moving forward. How confident does everyone feel identifying a red maple tree? And it's okay if you don't feel too confident. We're going to be going over it a little more tonight. Oh, everyone is. All right, this is what we like to see. All right, great. Thank you so much for your participation with these questions. Um, Katie Beals is now going to take over and tell us about the wonderful Phenology Trail at the Vassar Ecological Preserve.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren, for the wonderful introduction. You could go to the next slide. So I'm Katie Beals, and like Lauren said, I am the Student Conservation Association member at the Vassar Farm and Ecological Preserve. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about our Phenology Trail, which we track phenology at the preserve, and what kind of plants we are tracking. So next slide, please. So why do we have a phenology trail in the first place? Vassar Farm and Ecological Preserve is part of the EMMA network, which stands for Environmental Monitoring and Management Alliance. And this is a regional network of 14 organizations in the Hudson Valley that share monitoring information and inform sustainable management and conservation practices, all while trying to engage the public in what they're doing. So, like I said, these 14 organizations have come together and set 4 priorities for the Hudson Valley of what they want to focus on in the future. So, the 4 priorities are climate change, deer overabundance, habitat loss and fragmentation, and invasive species. In response to these 4 priorities, they have designed some projects to go along with them. For example, deer exposure surveys, in which they look at seedlings and saplings inside exclosures versus outside, looking at camera traps to see how animals are using the lands that EMMA has, and a weather station network throughout the EMMA Alliance to track weather patterns through the whole Hudson Valley. And lastly, the Phenology Trail project, and 8 EMMA members have established their own Phenology Trail. So Vassar Farm participates in all 4 of these projects, but the EMMA network has some pilot projects that are coming up, and we're super excited for those. So next slide, please. The EMMA network is also part of the New York Phenology Project, which is a statewide collaboration between schools, land trusts, research organizations, nonprofits who have launched their own independent phenology trail. And since each trail is established by an individual organization, they are unique to each organization, and they can be made to meet the organization's goals and mission, and they they are either run by volunteers or only run by staff. So since there's so much variation across the state in how these are run, the New York Phenology Project has made a standardized protocol of how to run the Phenology Trail, and has released a suggested species list, which contains species that grow in an urban to rural gradient. So we can kind of track how climate change changes phenology throughout the entire state in different environments. And I thought that this was a good graph to kind of explain, why does phenology monitoring matter, and why does change in climate matter. Like Lauren explained, monitoring phenology can be used as an indicator of climate change. So in the top half of this picture, it shows a typical year with normal cues in which the birds lay their eggs, and then by the time that the eggs hatch, there's an abundance of caterpillars for them to eat. And the bottom shows a mismatch in phenology in which the cues have come too late. So the bird lays their eggs, but then the peak in caterpillar abundance comes before the eggs hatch, leaving the birds hungry. So all species react to climate change in a different manner. So some may shift their phenology closer to the winter, some may shift their changes closer to the summer, and no two species are going to be alike in their shifts. That's why it's really important that we are tracking the phenology states right now. And just a note, the one stage of a plant or animal's lifetime is called a phenophase. So that would be something like the buds breaking, the leaves coming out, or the plant fruiting. So here at Vassar Farm and Ecological Preserve, our trail starts right outside the Collins Field Station along the wood line, and then it goes into the Collins Trail. It's about a mile long, and it takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete observations along the trail. We have 56 individual plants that we monitor within 19 species, and there's also 9 animal observations that are optional as well. So like I mentioned, the Emma network has established 8 phenology trails throughout its whole network, and the Vassar farm was part of them. So since 2014, when it was established, there have been over 4,000 observations. And like I mentioned previously, an observation is saying, yes, this phenophase is present right now. And this year we have some super exciting news. We have 2 new additions to our trail. One is a vernal pool monitoring station. We're tracking the flooding of vernal pools along the trail because they're very important amphibian breeding habitat. And we're also monitoring a new red maple along the trail at eye level. All the rest of our red maples are very tall trees, so it takes some binoculars and squinting to kind of track the next phenophase that's happening. So the logistics of us monitoring, each of our 56 plants is labeled with a tag. Our native species have a blue tag and our invasive species have a red tag. On this tag, it says the name and Latin name of the plant and a number. And these correlate with an app called Nature's Notebook. And this is a free app that individuals or organizations can use to track the phenology of plants near them. So we have our own trail on the app, and this app is made by the National Phenology Network. So all the data that is submitted into the app is put into a nationwide database that anybody can access, which is great because having a nationwide idea of how phenology shifts during climate change is even better than a statewide one. So anybody around the country can download this data and see how things are shifting. And here are the lovely students that help us monitor. Our trail would not exist today if we didn't have the support of Vassar College. So in the past, there have been classes that have students come out and make observations on the trail as participation credit. This year was a little bit different, but we do have 2 environmental monitoring work study students, Swan and Sophie, who you can see here using binoculars to make observations. And we do have 1 volunteer, Evan, who in this picture is standing next to our new vernal pool monitoring station. Like I said, student engagement in this is key to our success and longevity. So we're super thankful for everything that they do since it is a weekly commitment. So what species do we monitor? All the species we monitor fall into 6 broad categories: spring ephemerals, native trees, native shrubs, native forbs, invasive species, and animals, which are the optional observations. So for the rest of my presentation, I'll be talking about each of these groups and why it's important that we monitor them. I'll start with the spring ephemerals. These are plants that grow when the canopy is open and there's a lot of sunlight that gets to the forest floor. They complete their entire life cycle in the spring before anything leaves out. So we monitor bloodroot, Canadian wild ginger, dogtooth violet, and Virginia spring beauty. Out of these four, only the last two are true spring ephemerals because the first two actually hold on to their leaves throughout the rest of the year. So why are they monitored? Um, According to our Conservation Action Plan, these were designated as indicator species of a healthy forest composition. So if they're missing or altered in a forest, it gives us kind of a red flag saying, this forest isn't doing great. What's wrong with it? What is happening? So we can take a better look at it. Also, a warmer winter and shorter spring may cue the shrubs and trees above these plants to leaf out sooner, completely shading out the sun that they need in order to grow. And if these bloom too early, the pollinators that rely on them for nutrition won't be able to gain the nutrition they need. And these plants actually rely on pollinators to spread their seeds sometimes, so they'll miss out on that as well. We monitor native trees as well. These four trees are suggested by the New York Phenology Project as they're found statewide: the eastern red cedar, flowering dogwood, white ash, and northern red oak. Like all other plants, trees respond to temperature cues and sunlight cues to know when they should complete their next phenophase. If these cues come too early and their buds start growing before frost damage is over, it may damage them for the whole season, or if the cues come too late, they will be cutting into a valuable resource collection time that they need. Also, tracking bud break is a good way to track the health of a tree. If a tree is spending too much energy maintaining themselves and kind of healing, then it might not have the energy to make leaves or flowers. An example on our trail is the white ash, which is being affected by the emerald ash borer, which can damage and eventually kill the trees. On the preserve, we do treat some of our ash trees for emerald ash borer, but we just can't treat them all. So tracking the bud break gives us an idea of overall health of the tree and informs management practices for the future. These are the three maples that we track on the trail. All of these species are also suggested by the New York Phenology Project since they grow in a wide range of environments. The red maple and silver maple are great to be tracked on the Phenology Trail because they're some of the first flowers of spring, so they're a good indicator of when spring cues are starting to happen. Sugar maple has a little bit of a different phenology than the other two. It typically fruits a little bit later in the season, so that's also useful information to have. We only track one native shrub, but it's a very important shrub. It is northern spice bush. It is crucial to track this phenology because it's the host to two swallowtail butterflies. It's also one of the earlier flowering shrubs. Like I said before, that's a good indicator of when spring cues are happening. And of course, it's good first nutrition for insects. And our native forbs are New York ironweed, wild bergamot, jewelweed, common milkweed, and common yarrow. All of these are utilized by pollinators in some form. Some of them are more generalists, like the New York ironweed, which supports butterflies and bees when it's flowering, and then later in the year when it produces seeds, it supports birds. But some are more specialists, like the common milkweed, which is the only host for monarch butterflies. It's important to track these species phenology because it can impact other species, like the bees and butterflies. And we do track invasive species on our trail, like the Japanese barberry and Amur honeysuckle. And in the current climate, invasive species already have an advantage. They leaf out earlier in the spring than our natives, and they hold on to their leaves longer, which allows them to collect more resources throughout the year. This is called extended leaf phenology. And we think that a changing climate may give them an even bigger advantage, allowing even longer growing seasons and more resource collection. We started tracking the invasive shrubs on our Phenology Trail as part of the Shady Invaders campaign through the National Phenology Network to understand how extended leaf phenology gives invasives the advantage and how this impacts our forests. And like I mentioned before, plants are not the only thing that rely on temperature and weather cues to know what to do in their next stage of life. So climate changes can cause a mismatch with their necessary resources for all of these animals. The American toad, spring peeper, and wood frog rely on vernal pools for reproduction since they have no fish that will eat their young. But with climate change, a pool might not fill up or it might dry out too early before the tadpoles have left. This would be really detrimental to their population. The butterflies and bees also rely on their phenology matching up with flower resources to gain nutrition. This also helps the flowers. The monarchs and the birds are migratory species, so they use cues in the weather and temperature to know when to migrate. But like I mentioned before as well, not all species and cues are the same. So down south, the weather cues might come earlier or later, causing these species to migrate earlier or later and missing the resources that they need up here that they can't get again. And if this really struck your fancy, we usually do have volunteers from the community helping out on the preserve, but sadly this year we are not open to the public due to COVID. We're hoping, fingers crossed, to open back up soon. Keep an eye on our social media. We will let you guys know when we're reopening. But once we do, email Cary Van Camp or the Ecological Preserve email. We can set you up with the time to be trained on the Phenology Trail. If you're a Vassar student, the preserve is open to you. So if you're interested in doing that now, you can totally do that. But if you're really itching to get out there, the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies has the Fern Glen Phenology Trail, which is open to the public. And if you want to get involved in that, Vicki Kelly is the contact person, and she happens to be the next speaker. So with that, I will pass it off to her.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Katie. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, I am going to share my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. So, oh, there we go. Share. Okay, let's see. All right, can you all see my screen that says Red Maple Phenology? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I am Vicki Kelly. I am a program manager at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. I run our environmental monitoring program, and that includes our Fern Glen Phenology Trail. I want to point out that I'm talking to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Wappinger and Mohican people. So Lauren and Katie talked about the Vassar College Ecological Preserve and about phenology in general, and about red maples um, in general as well. And so I'm going to focus a bit on red maple phenology and really dive into its amazing story. So this is a slide of the red maple's life cycle. Let's see if I can find. So it's a deciduous species, which means it loses its leaves. So during the winter, it looks like this. It's dormant, and all of its nutrients are tucked away in its roots and its stems and the wood of the tree. And it hunkers down through the winter in a dormant state. The very first thing it does in the spring is it flowers. And so it's a really interesting species. Usually the trees are either male or female. So the male trees will produce these flowers that have sort of a yellowish hue to them. That's the pollen of the flower, and the female trees produce just female flowers. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about this in a minute. So if you're driving down the road in say early April, late March, maybe mid-April, you might see a tree that has it could be a really beautiful bright red. It could just have a reddish hue to it. That's probably a female red maple tree. If you see a tree that has a red hue, but there's sort of a yellowish tone to it, that's probably a male red maple tree. All right, the next thing that happens is these female trees will produce seeds, and these seeds are these gorgeous red maples are called red maples for a really good reason. They are red um, at the two key changing seasons. So these seeds in right about now, they're developing. In a few weeks they'll be ripe. Once they ripen, they'll all fly off the trees all at once, and they have these winged seeds that are sort of reddish. Sometimes they're pinkish. All right, and only the female trees will produce these seeds. After that, the leaf buds will break out and the leaves will expand, and the tree will spend the summer doing the job of photosynthesizing and growing. They'll be taking up carbon dioxide, emitting oxygen into the atmosphere, and making food so they can grow. Long period of time where they just hunker down and get to the business of photosynthesis and growth. Then in the fall, they turn this gorgeous red color. Sometimes they're not quite so bright and gorgeous, but the chlorophyll that's in these leaves gets drawn back into the twigs of the tree, and that reveals the other pigments that are always in the leaves but are masked by the green chlorophyll. And those pigments are these really gorgeous reds, oranges, and yellows. And then eventually in the fall, the leaves will fall off the tree and they'll enter their long winter of dormancy again. So there's the life cycle. Let's look a little bit more closely at some of these stages. As I said, the trees are usually either female or male. And this is called dioecious. It's a scientific term we apply to plants that do this. So the female trees have these two little protrusions. The flowers have these two little protrusions, and those are called styles. And they're just little tubes that go down to the base of the flower where there are eggs. There are structures called eggs. And the male trees have just this profusion of these things that stick out, and they're called stamens. And at the end of it are these structures called anthers, and they produce all this pollen. And all this pollen will be released into the wind, and they'll eventually find these little protrusions on the female flowers, and the pollen will migrate down to that little tube to where the egg is, and it'll fertilize that egg, and then that egg will start to turn into a seed. So the really interesting thing about red maples is that while most of the time they're dioecious, they either produce female flowers or male flowers. Every once in a while, you'll find a tree that produces some female flowers and some male flowers, and even some trees that produce what we call perfect flowers. And those are flowers that have both male and female structures on them. And the most amazing thing is that sometimes they switch. So you might have a tree that produces all female flowers year after year after year. And then every once in a while, it'll produce both male and female flowers, and vice versa with these male trees. We have no idea what triggers this, why they do it. It's a mystery that has been with us for hundreds of years, and we have not figured out what makes them switch and change their sex like that. So really cool trees. All right, so mid-spring, right about now, what happens is these trees that had male flowers, those flowers will start to die off. And you can see right here, there's this leaf bud that's just breaking open. And on the female trees, instead of the flowers dropping off, they'll start to develop these seeds. And that's happening right about now. And at the same time, you see on this structure, you see on this branch right here, you see a breaking open leaf bud. So as the seeds are developing, the leaf buds are just popping open and the leaves are starting to pop out. Eventually, in a few weeks after the leaves come out, these seeds will ripen and they'll dry out a little bit and they'll have these characteristic wings on them called samaras. Like all maple trees, there's two of the seeds on each little petiole here. Um, and they will, when they're released, and the trees they'll ripen and fly off the tree in just a matter of a day or two. And when they fly off the tree, they look like little whirligigs. Or sometimes kids call them helicopters. And they spin around and around and around, and that is a trait that allows them to get caught on the wind and dispersed far away from their parent tree. So those are the seeds. And during this time, you can kind of see in this picture, there's leaves that are out, but they're still expanding. And eventually in late spring, you'll see the trees look like this. The leaves are out. There's still maybe a couple of leaves that are still expanding in size, but for the most part, they're big and they're the size that they're going to be all summer. Note that again, Lauren talked about the toothed edge to the leaf. This is characteristic of red maple. If it was smooth along the edge of the leaf, it would probably be either a sugar maple or a Norway maple. Okay, so here they are late spring and all through the summer. This is what they're going to look like. They're going to crank out oxygen and sugars to grow with, take in carbon dioxide, and just work at photosynthesis. And then in the fall, again, the chlorophyll will be reabsorbed from the leaf into the twigs of the branches, and the pigments that are always in the leaf, but we don't see them because they're masked by the chlorophyll, those will be revealed. And in red maple, it's this typical bright red color. Often you'll see a tree like this with a bright beautiful red foliage, but not uncommonly you see trees that are there's sort of an orange and yellow colors as well, and they look like a lighter orange in the forest. And this is a picture of this tree, a little close up. And then the leaves will fall off the tree and they'll enter dormancy again for the winter. All right, so Lauren and Katie talked about phenology monitoring. Sometimes we refer to this as reading nature's clock. And what do we mean by that? And I define it as the study of the timing of seasonal changes and life cycle events. So that's a life cycle event, or a phenophase is, say, the onset of flowering in the spring or the onset of color change in the fall. So we're studying when those life cycle changes happen, and we study them over a long period of time. We know that the seasons have different temperatures. We know they have different day lengths, and we know that over time our temperature is changing, it's increasing. But we don't know how are these trees and other organisms going to respond to that climate change. So the organisms are reading the clock of nature and responding to it. So that's why we sometimes call the phenology monitoring reading nature's clock. It's the study of the timing of seasonal changes and life cycle events over long periods of time. So what drives these shifts in phenophases? Well, what we think is that there's a window of time, and that window of time is determined by day length. And the trees have evolved, and other organisms have evolved over long periods of time. And so encoded in their genetics is the response to that day length change. So the day length might trigger the onset of flowering or the onset of leaf color change. But that's a pretty broad window, we think, that those changes can happen. Within that window, we think what determines when plants shift phenophases, when they start to a new life cycle phase, we think what determines that are climate variables like temperature and precipitation. So within this window that's set by day length and the genetics of the plant, precipitation and temperature, these climate variables, affect when those phenophase changes happens, when those trees start to flower or change color in the fall. Okay, so what do we expect with climate change? Well, this is a hypothetical graph with, on the x-axis, we have time in years. So over here on the left might be, say, the year 2000, and over here on the right might be the year 2020. And on the y-axis, we have the day of the year. So low on the axis is early in the year, and high on the axis is late in the year. So in the spring, what we expect is that if we were to plot the day that red maple started flowering every year for a long period of time, we'd be able to draw a line through those points, and the line would go down like this, which would mean that the plants are flowering, or the leaves are popping out earlier and earlier and earlier. And what we expect in the fall is the opposite, that if we plot the day that we see a leaf color, the first leaf color change in, say, red maples, every year, we'd be able to draw a line through all those points, and the line would go like this. It would go up, meaning that the leaf color change, or the leaf drop, is happening later and later and later as we go through the years. So this is hypothetical. This is what we expect, or what we're looking for when we study phenology. So let's look at some evidence. What do we actually see? All right, this is a graph from the National Phenology Network of the entire eastern United States. And it's on the y-axis, we have the onset of red maple flowers. So these are the first days that red maple flowers were observed for many, many sites throughout the eastern US for the year 2011 all the way till this year. And you don't see any pattern. We don't see that line going down that we thought we'd see. And we think that is because there's just an enormous range across this big broad area in the timing of when these red maples flower, all the way from the beginning of January till almost December. So this is a really big range, and we think that's of days, and we think that's why we don't see a pattern for such a broad area. So what if we narrow the area that we're looking at? And so this is another plot from the National Phenology Network, and it's for a corridor from New York City to Albany. And that represents roughly the area that is represented in the Environmental Monitoring and Management Alliance, which we refer to as EMMA. And you can see from this graph that when we look at a narrower band of red maple trees, we actually are starting to see this trend towards earlier and earlier flowering. How about if we look at individual sites? So this is a group of 6 of the EMMA sites that are monitoring red maple. And each one of these dots represents the day of the year that we first saw red maple flowers for each of these sites. So here we are at the Cary Institute's Fern Glen Phenology Trail. And in it was probably 2014, we saw red maples flowering roughly at about day 120. And what you can see from this group set of graphs is that at 4 of the 6 different sites, we are seeing this trend towards earlier and earlier flowering. And this group of people at Hawthorne Valley unearthed this just treasure trove of data from the 1850s from sites around New York. And so I put on these graphs a point for sites that aren't exactly at the same spot as these sites, but so here's a point from West Point. It's not far from Mohonk Preserve. And you can see in 1853, they were seeing flowers significantly earlier than we're seeing them now. And the similar thing that we see in Hawthorne Valley up in Columbia County. Chatham is in Columbia County, not exactly in the same location, but you can see that flowers were observed earlier in 1851 than they're being observed now. Similar but not exactly. Again, at Teatown Lake Reservation in Westchester, North Salem is a site in Westchester, and you can see in 1851. Here's when they were observing red maple flowers. Here's where we're observing them now. So we're seeing this trend in flowering earlier and earlier at 5 of these 6 sites. Sorry. So again, what do we expect? I'm gonna talk about fall. What do we expect in the fall? We expect things to happen later and later. So we're thinking we're going to see a line that looks like this. So again, this is for the entire eastern United States, and this is instead of flowers, this is the onset of colored leaves. So this is when colored leaves were first observed at all of these sites across the eastern United States from 2011 all the way to 2000. This year, there's actually someplace in the eastern United States, there's a plant that has colored leaves. So again, really big range of time that colored leaves are observed on red maples. And we think that's why we don't see any kind of a trend here. What if we narrow to this corridor from New York City to Albany, the corridor that is similar to the Emma network? Again, we don't see any trend. We a really big range of dates that colored leaves are observed, and no trend. And what if we look at the individual Emma sites? So for this, it's not as clear cut as with flowers. Only 2 of the 6 sites show this trend of later and later leaf color change. And unfortunately, there weren't data from the 1850s to put on here on leaf color change. So not as clear as flowering, but some evidence that there is a response among red maples to climate change in terms of the leaf color change. Okay, so I'm going to sum up and talk a little bit about why we care about this. So in the spring, we saw really good evidence that flowering is trending earlier. So red maples are responding to climate change. Why do we care? Well, if flowers are popping out earlier and earlier every year, and if they are if they're flowering too early, they could be subject to really hard frosts or late snowfall events, and that could result in failed reproduction. And if this happens once in a while, it's probably not a big deal. But if you think about it, if the flowers are coming out earlier every year, and there's hard frosts or snowstorms, late spring snowstorms, and there's persistent failed reproduction, this could really imperil our lovely red maple species. In the fall, what we see is leaf color change. There is some evidence that it's trending later, not complete evidence. So the jury's still out on that. We're not sure if red maples are going to be resistant to fall changes in climate change. Why do we care? Well, if trees are changing color later, that means the leaves are going to be on the trees later. And then if there's an early snow, that's going to result in branches, and that is going to do damage to trees. So we care about this because we are experiencing climate change. We want to know how our beloved red maples are responding. Red maple is a really important species. It's typically considered a really resilient species. It's very common. It's one of our most common species in our woods in this area. And it's obviously it grows all over the eastern United States. So if we need to know what's happening with red maple. So we still have to, even though we have a little bit of data here, we still have to keep monitoring it to really understand its survival in the face of climate change. All right, I want to thank the multitude of really wonderful volunteers who go out every week and collect these data. I want to thank the National Phenology Network for whom we would not be able to do this. It's their initiative that makes this all possible. And I want to thank all of you for attending tonight and listening to us. And with that, I will turn it back over to Katie and Lauren for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vicki, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you to Katie as well. We are so thankful to have you both here with us tonight. So now we have just a couple minutes. So our Q&A is open. So you can put your answer in the chat and I will read it out loud. So I see we have one. It's, are there any other tree species that are equally as important for monitoring climate change in this area? And Katie says she will answer this question.
No, I'm sorry. I clicked the wrong button.
So either Katie or Vicki can chime in.
Well, we can both answer it. There are many really good species to monitor. Katie talked about the different trees that they're monitoring on the preserve, the ecological preserve, Vassar Ecological Preserve. All of them are really important. We really do need to know how trees are responding to climate change. This is the key method to understand that. So yeah, we're monitoring sugar maples and red oaks and white oaks across the EMMA network and across the National Phenology Network. Katie, feel free to add to that.
I guess another thing to add to that is the New York Phenology Project has a whole huge list of suggested species to track, and they wouldn't suggest them if they weren't important to monitor for climate change. And most of those species they have suggested because they're in a range of places across the state. So there's even more important ones within little segments of places across the state, like rare plants are equally as important as big trees.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vicki and Katie. So our next question is, could you tell us the website that was up at the end of Vicki's segment? It was about joining in as a citizen observer. And I think that was Nature's Notebook, Vicki, correct?
Yeah,
I'm
yes.
going to be sending out an email tomorrow that has links to the Environmental Cooperative, the Cary Institute, Nature's Notebook, and the New York Phenology Project. So there'll be more information there on how to get involved. Oh, and then also, Katie, you had shared a list of species being monitored. There were some invasive species on that list. Are they being monitored for the same reason, or are they being monitored for more species spread?
So on the Phenology Trail, they're mostly being monitored to see how they respond to climate change. But on the preserve in general, we take monitoring invasive species really seriously. So we're monitoring constantly for up and coming invasives, as well as tracking what kind of invasive spread there is already.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. Right, and I think that's all the questions we have right now, and it is also past 8. So I want to thank again, Vicki and Katie. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for your presentations. Oh, we have one more question. We have time for one more quick one. So do trees really migrate as a species? I can't remember where I read this, but it was something to the effect of trees moving out of the area and into Canada.
I can talk a little bit about it, and then if Vicki wants to jump in and explain it more, that would be great. So right now, where we are, it's called a climate envelope. So it's the perfect area for these specific trees to be growing. And with climate change, the climate envelopes are kind of generally shifting more north and also up in elevation. So the area where these trees will grow best will move north, and they'll also move up, like up mountains. So as climate changes, we expect to see these species kind of shifting, but it also depends on how well their seeds can disperse and other factors such as that. Vicki, you can add.
Yeah, no, you did a great job. I was just going to point out that, you know, trees don't migrate, but species do. So there are people who are doing projections of where species will occur under different climate scenarios, and they're astonishing when you plot it out and you map it out. There, you know, there are species that will be here that we don't see, but it'll take, you know, longer than our lifetimes for that to happen.
Thank you. And we have one more question. I was wondering if it is changes in temperature or precipitation due to climate change that are changing phenology.
I would say it's almost certainly temperature. One of the things that we hope to be able to do, that the Emma network has both weather stations and phenology trails, and we're hoping that with those two data sets, we'll be able to drill down and answer this with definitively. Um, so, but right now it's almost certainly temperature. We believe that, but we definitely need to keep studying it.
Great. Thank you so much. Those were all really wonderful and insightful questions. So with that, we're going to sign off for tonight and say goodnight, but there will be a recording of this webinar available. It'll be made available tomorrow, and I'll also be sending it out with the email that includes the links to those resources I mentioned just a few minutes ago. So again, thank you so much for your attendance and participation, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.